We are in week 6 of RELS 100. Our last week of the oldest Western religion we're studying, Judaism. Judaism has so many great features and quotations from it. This comes from the Mishnah, which I will cover later. And it's also in the book, The World's Wisdom by Philip Novak on page 217. There was a single person first created to teach thee that if anyone destroy a single soul, Scripture charges him as though he had destroyed a whole world. And whoever rescues a single soul, Scripture credits him as though he has saved a whole world. The Holy One has stamped all mankind with the die of the first man, and yet not one of them is like to this his fellow. Therefore, everyone is bound up to say, for my sake was the universe created. This great saying, which makes its way into, I have to say, my favorite, or at least one of my very favorite movies, Schindler's List. We're looking at Judaism now in the first century of the Common Era, the time in which the Jew Jesus comes and teaches and starts a new movement. But I want to look at Judaism more broadly in the first century first, before then we move into Christianity next week. Jewish groups responded to the problems of the first century quite differently. In the first century CE, Jewish historian Flavius Josephus wrote on these groups in his history called the Antiquities of the Jews. So as we saw in the last weeks, the Jews were responding to being overwhelmed and overrun by foreign oppressors. At this time, they were under the thumb of the Roman government and always were looking for a return to a messianic leader, to the full celebration and worship in the temple, to the law of Torah, to the fullness of what God had promised as they saw it from the Hebrew Bible. So there are four main groups, so much that we might call these different ways even of being Jewish in the first century. The first group is the Pharisees, which was a lay renewal movement. They were zealous for the law and oral tradition. They believed in resurrection of the body and not the immortality of the soul. So at the end of the time in the Messianic age, both body and soul, that unity that God creates in the second chapter of Genesis, when God breathes the breath into the dust, that would be resurrected, not like the immortality of the soul, which we see, say, in Greek philosophy, in Socrates, where our bodies aren't nearly as important as our souls, and it's our souls that go, this immaterial essence that goes into the great beyond, we'll just say. The Pharisees, if you know the New Testament, had quite a bit of controversy in those pages with Jesus, but interestingly enough, they agree with much of Jesus' teaching. And then there were also the Sadducees. These were mainly priests who controlled the temple. They had, because they had power, they had ties with the Roman government. They held only to Torah, these first 5 books, and thus believed in no resurrection. So that's why some say that the Sadducees were sad, you see. Yes, that is a terrible joke. So I'm going to read from a book, you'll see the cover in the next slide, from it's Joel Green, who is one of my professors in my PhD. And he wrote in the Gospel, How to Read the Gospel in Acts, this. The Pharisees. Pharisaism was essentially a lay movement which took seriously the obligation laid upon Israel to be a holy nation. For Pharisees, this entailed an emphasis on maintaining purity in everyday life, so that what was historically expected in terms of holiness within the temple now became normative outside the temple. Hence, the temple did not occupy a central stage for Pharisees. Instead, the Torah was spotlighted. And we're going to see how this plays out after the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era. The move among Pharisees was towards spelling out the implications of the law so that it was absolutely relevant for every aspect of life. Personal holiness could be practiced in everyday life, and so they adopted a passive tolerance of Hellenization. Hellenization, the Greekanization, the Greek making of Judaism in the area of the Levant or Israel, that came in the 4th century before the Common Era, about 300 years before the 400 years before this time with Alexander the Great. The Sadducees, on the other hand, Dr. Green writes, were apparently quite friendly toward the influx of Hellenistic culture, in so much as they represented the aristocracy of a Jewish society. They had most to gain from changes in educational, economic, and political spheres. Sadducees held a much more conservative attitude toward the law, believing that the priestly laws of the Torah were limited to priests and the goings-on in the temple. The temple and its priesthood then constituted the focal point of Israel's holiness. So the question is at this time, what is going to bring God's reign back? As the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright puts it, when God would become king. And for the Sadducees, that had to do with temple worship. That's what Israel had to get back to. For the Pharisees, it was law obedience to God's direction and instruction. Okay, here's one example. Quoting again from Green, unlike the Pharisees, the Sadducees rejected the notion of resurrection, for they were unable to locate the idea in the Torah. Hence, Pharisaism was more a party for the people, but the real power brokers of first century Palestine were the Sadducees. All right, moving on then to the two other forms of Judaism. Both given the number 3. So pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. The second 3, of course, is 4. The discovery between 1947 and 1956 of the Dead Sea Scrolls was one of the most exciting discoveries, I'm adding, in all of archaeology, but certainly biblical archaeology. It was at Qumran, and it greatly increased our understanding of the diversity within Judaism at the time of Jesus. While the Essenes were not to be found exclusively at Qumran, the remains of this monastic community give us our best information about the sect. At the heart of Qumranic expression of Judaism is a sectarian stance over against Judaism as a whole, and that's impure, tainted by Hellenistic influence. So they were a splinter group, often associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, seeking radical purity, awaiting an age to come. I've visited Qumran twice. It's as has been mentioned, over by the Dead Sea, which is east of Jerusalem. And they were, as our tour guide said, more Catholic than the Pope. They were more holy than any other Jews. They had a intense concern for the ritual cleansing, the ritual baths. They had numerous ritual baths that they would go through in order to be cleansed and holy. And they believed in what's called the eschatological temple, which was their community. So eschatology is the end times, the messianic age, the age to come was what they were creating through their community. They were the remnant. Finally, there were the Zealots. So they were, well, let's just read what Joel Green says. The Zealots, too, reacted strongly against Hellenism. However, instead of withdrawing, like the Qumran sectarians, their response was one of militant defiance, perhaps holding in high regard the earlier Judas Maccabeus, who led the Maccabean revolt, which we've seen in 167. The Zealots directed their efforts towards purging Palestine from alien influence and overlordship. So there's even a group called Zachari who would come and knife people who were part of Rome, the Roman military, as a way of overthrowing the government. They were not established as a group until about 66 of the Common Era, although, of course, there were roots earlier in first century Judaism. I mention that because there was a famous book a well-known book came out a few years ago that described Jesus as a zealot, and this would be quite difficult if because Jesus died in probably 33 of the Common Era. So I've read this before, but I think it's now pertinent again. This is how Malloy, in Experiencing the World's Religion, describes what the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era meant. A major change was brought with the destruction of the Second Temple of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era, which brought about the end of temple-based ceremonial religion of that region and the widespread dispersion of its people to lands far away from Israel. So when the temple gets destroyed, the Sadducees lose big time, and the Pharisees gain an ascendancy. And as we'll see, people who did things like the Zealots got so put down, militarily, that they didn't have much to offer either. Following the calamity of the temple's destruction, the earlier religion had to be developed in new ways to survive. From the centralized temple-based religion practiced in Israel, another form of religion arose that could be practiced among the Jews who lived outside of Israel. So instead of focusing on Jerusalem and the temple there was a way of moving out into the synagogues. So as I've described before, in ancient Israel, there was always a relationship between temple and synagogue. Now there was no temple, so synagogue, the meeting place, was the key. To continue with Malloy, Jews anywhere in the world could now practice their religion in the home and synagogue. In recognition of this fundamental religious reorientation, a distinction is often made between biblical Judaism and rabbinical Judaism. So biblical Judaism, the Judaism we read about in the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, and then rabbinical Judaism, which comes later and is developed, or rabbinic Judaism. That's especially at the site in Jamnia or Javne. It's an academy founded by Yohanan ben Zakkai about 15 miles south of Tel Aviv, 25 miles east of Jerusalem. Thus, with the temple destroyed, Pharisaic Judaism wins out, as I've mentioned. And there, the kind of reflection on the Hebrew scriptures became central in the Talmud, which is the recording of oral tradition surrounding the Torah. And it's really an additional sacred scripture for Judaism. And then there were two Talmuds, the Babylonian from about 600 in the Common Era, and the Palestinian from about 400, which contains also the Mishnah, which were the first writings around 200. I'm going to give you a little more detail about that. This comes from reformjudaism.org. The Talmud, which is the Hebrew for study, is one of the central works of the Jewish people. It is the record of rabbinic teachings that span a period of about 600 years, beginning in the 1st century CE and continuing through the 6th and 7th centuries CE. The rabbinic teachings of the Talmud explain in great detail how the commandments of Torah are to be carried out. The Talmud is made up of two separate works. The Mishnah, primarily a compilation of Jewish laws written in Hebrew and edited sometime around 200 of the Common Era in Israel, and the Gemara, the rabbinic commentaries and discussions on the Mishnah written in Hebrew and Aramaic, which emanated from Israel and Babylonia over the next 300 years. Aramaic, by the way, is a simplified form of Hebrew, so it's what Jesus probably spoke. It was spoken as Hebrew began to get lost in the Hellenization of Israel. There are two Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, as I've mentioned. The Babylonian Talmud, which was edited after the Jerusalem Talmud and is much more widely known, is generally considered more authoritative. So go back to an example here. The Torah teaches us that that one is prohibited from working on the Sabbath. But what does that mean? There is no detailed definition in Torah of work. The Talmud tractate called Shabbat, therefore, devotes an entire chapter to the meaning of work and the various categories of prohibited work. So you'll see, as we get to the records of Jesus' life, he had a lot of controversies with these additions to Torah that were being discussed in his day in the early 1st century. So from the first millennium of the Common Era and even beyond, I wanted to show you just a few high points for how Judaism developed. We will get back to this as we begin to wind in together Christianity and Islam. Around 70, we already saw in Jamnia that's their center of rabbinic learning. And here's what's key, 132 to 135. After a revolt by the Jews, led by Simeon bar Kokhba, the son of the star, the emperor, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, no longer crushes the revolt, as armies do, and Jews are no longer to live within the site of their capital, Jerusalem. In 138, after the death of Hadrian, Antonius Pius, Hadrian's successor, ends the persecution, and Jewish religious life is allowed. So again, really, moving quickly here. We'll see in the 8th through 11th centuries there's a gradual development away from Palestine, Israel, the Levant, to Babylonia as a center for Judaism. And then by 11th century, there's the center of Jewish spiritual life moving to Spain, where there's even a kind of golden age. Just to bring you up to a couple of forms of contemporary Judaism, this is almost like a coda. The key festivals of Jewish life are Purim in March, the deliverance of Jews in the Persian Empire from the enemies, the Passover in spring, which celebrates Exodus from Egypt. In 2020, that was from April 8th to April 16th, so it just gives you a kind of idea of when it is. There's Rosh Hashanah, the top of the year in September, the first days of the Jewish calendar. Sukkot in October celebrates a fall harvest festival. Yom Kippur, usually in October, September, is the Day of Atonement, the holiest of the Jewish calendar. And then Hanukkah in December is the liberation of the temple by Mattathias, the Hasmonean, and the miracle of oil. Again, just quickly, contemporary forms of Judaism. I will return to this when we get back to all three religions together. But according to Stephen Prothero, in his book, God is Not One, about 21% of Jews are Orthodox, which is the most conservative form of Judaism. For example, prayers are in Hebrew, women and men sit apart in worship, and all Torah, oral and written, comes from God. Conservative is about 33%. It's the middle point between Orthodoxy and Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism is the most influential in the United States, about 39% of the Jews. The Torah is holy, but read is given at a specific time and place. This is the form of Judaism that I am most encounter with most, especially in the work I do in science and religion. One of my friends and colleagues, Jeff Mittleman, who runs Sinai and Synapses, is out of this form of Judaism. It accepts female rabbis and performs same-sex weddings, of course, which is part of some of the changes in religious life in the 21st century. There are also other trajectories. To be Jewish does not necessarily mean to be religious in the sense of having a faith. There are, would you say, we could call it atheist Jews or perhaps secular Jews. There's also about 6% that are estimated that are in the Reconstructionist, Humanistic, and Jewish renewal movements. If you look at Prothero, you might think about in his book, God is Not One, how does he describe these different branches of Judaism? We saw how Judaism was responding to the crises of the first and second centuries of the Common Era. How are these forms of Judaism responding to the modern world in our day, in our time? The final little coda is my pitch about papers. So in this class, you will be writing lots of papers. And papers I don't do just because they're academic activities, but because they are important in what once you graduate in whatever kind of work you do. In the various kinds of work I've done in profit and nonprofit and outside of the academic world, it's really important to write well, to organize one's thoughts well, to create letters that are powerful, letters probably not sent through the U.S. mail, but by email. Writing is one of the best forms of thinking, and that's one reason why I do it. I've often mentioned that key elements are unity and logical progression. Especially, does each paragraph have a unity? Does it present a unifying theme? If I had one theme or one word in each paragraph, would it be true to what you're writing or what I'm writing? These are things I've learned myself. Does your writing have logical progression? I always think of that period at the end of a sentence, that there's a gap between one sentence and the next. Are you signaling how somebody can move over that period to the next sentence? Or vice versa, how does this idea in this sentence follow from what came before? All right, those are some ideas about papers, about Judaism today, but especially about Judaism in the 1st and 2nd centuries.